Everyone admired my boss. That was why the room laughed when he humiliated me. We were standing in the glass-walled atrium during a quarterly briefing, executives seated behind him, cameras streaming the event to every department. He paused mid-sentence, looked directly at me, and joked about how some people confused loyalty with confidence. Then he added my name. The laughter came instantly, safe and rehearsed, the kind people use when they think power is on their side. My face burned, but I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look surprised. I gathered my notebook, stood, and walked out while he continued smiling into the microphone. By the time the doors closed behind me, my phone was already vibrating with messages asking if I was okay. I didn't answer them. I went home, placed my access badge on the table, and sat in silence longer than I expected. That night, internal emails framed the moment as light-hearted leadership. No one questioned it. No one asked why the room had gone quiet afterward. What they didn't know is that I had already seen the pattern forming months earlier. The humiliation wasn't random. It was useful. And as I lay awake replaying the laughter, I realized something that scared me more than losing my job. Walking away hadn't removed me from the story. It had placed me outside his line of sight, where he'd never think to look again. When I first joined the company, my boss was the reason everyone stayed. He remembered birthdays, praised people by name, and spoke about teamwork like it was a personal philosophy. New hires quoted him. Senior leadership trusted him implicitly. In meetings, he made space for ideas, nodding thoughtfully before reframing them into something sharper. At the time, I felt lucky to work under someone so respected. The first few months were smooth. Projects moved quickly, and praise flowed generously. But over time, I noticed small shifts that didn't match the image. Success was always attributed upward, while mistakes somehow drifted sideways. People who questioned decisions were reassigned, then quietly gone. Their exits were framed as personal choices, always amicable, always unexplained. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, everyone admired him. During one project review, I watched him accept credit for a process I had designed, thanking me vaguely for support. The room nodded along. No one challenged it. Later, a colleague joked that visibility mattered more than contribution. I laughed too, uneasy. That was when I began paying closer attention, not to his speeches, but to outcomes. Patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They repeat softly until someone notices. And once you do, you can't unsee them. The pattern became clearer after the first unexpected departure. A senior analyst left days after closing a profitable deal, thanked publicly by my boss for setting the foundation. A week later, her name vanished from internal documentation. I checked archived files and found edits that removed her involvement entirely. At first, I assumed it was an error. Then it happened again. Another project, another quiet exit, another rewrite of history. I started keeping notes, dates, versions, nothing dramatic, just observations. When I mentioned it cautiously to a teammate, she brushed it off, reminding me how generous he was with opportunities. He wouldn't do that, she said. I stopped bringing it up. Instead, I watched how praise was used strategically, how public warmth softened private decisions. The more admired he became, the less anyone questioned him. During one review, I noticed contract language had been subtly adjusted, shifting accountability downward without changing authority. I recognized the structure because I had helped draft the original version. When I asked about the revision, my boss smiled and said it was above my scope now. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't coincidence or poor management. It was design. And the design depended on one thing above all else: no one believing that the admired leader could ever be the problem. Once I accepted that the pattern was intentional, everything else snapped into focus. Meetings stopped feeling collaborative and started feeling choreographed. My boss asked questions he already knew the answers to, guiding conversations toward conclusions he'd prepared in advance. When someone offered a strong idea, he praised the initiative, then assigned final refinement to himself. I began noticing how often he spoke last. Silence followed his words, not because he demanded it, but because people trusted him to be right. I tested my understanding quietly. On one project, I withheld a small optimization I'd developed, something that would noticeably improve results. The project underperformed slightly, just enough to draw attention. In the follow-up meeting, he blamed execution issues and reassigned the team lead. A week later, he presented my withheld optimization as part of a new strategic adjustment. Applause followed. No one questioned the timing. I documented everything, saving versions, emails, timestamps. It felt excessive at first, like paranoia. But patterns reward patience. The more I watched, the more precise it became. Admiration was his shield. It discouraged scrutiny and encouraged gratitude. People wanted to believe in him because believing felt safe. I realized then why he'd humiliated me publicly. It wasn't personal. It was preventative. Public doubt, once seated, had to be crushed early. As long as everyone laughed, no one would ask why I stopped contributing. And as long as no one asked, he could continue uninterrupted. I tried once to interrupt the cycle, carefully and without accusation. During a casual lunch, I asked a senior manager if she'd noticed how often successful teams dissolved afterward. She frowned, thought for a moment, then said turnover was normal at that level. I mentioned the documentation changes, framing it as concern for process integrity. She smiled sympathetically and told me not to overthink things. "He's earned our trust," she said. The conversation ended there. Word traveled faster than I expected. That afternoon, my boss stopped by my desk, praised my diligence, and suggested I focus on execution rather than structure. His tone was kind, but the message was clear. I was being noticed in the wrong way. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go. The job was stable. The pay was good. And confronting someone so admired felt like career suicide. That was the false hope. The belief that staying quiet would keep me safe. A week later, a junior colleague asked me for advice on a process I'd created months earlier. She didn't know I'd created it. She thought it came from my boss. I corrected her gently. She looked confused, then embarrassed, and later avoided me entirely. That was when I understood the cost. Silence wasn't neutrality here. It was consent. And consent was exactly what the pattern needed to survive. The next shift came quietly, disguised as recognition. My boss praised me during a department update, highlighting my supportive role and adaptability. The compliment sounded positive, but it reframed my work as auxiliary, not essential. Shortly after, key responsibilities were reassigned without discussion. Access permissions changed. Invitations stopped arriving. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, I was being edged out. I watched it happen with a strange calm, documenting each adjustment. The more distance he created, the clearer the structure became. He was isolating variables, reducing my visibility while preserving my output until it could be absorbed. When I requested clarification, he suggested I take time to reset, framing it as concern for my well-being. That was the moment I decided to leave. Not dramatically, not angrily. I waited until the next all-hands meeting when his authority was most visible. After the humiliation, after the laughter, I walked out because staying would have validated the performance. Leaving without protest denied him conflict, denied him closure. It also denied him something else he didn't realize he relied on. I had built systems no one else fully understood, safeguards that required my oversight to function smoothly. As I stepped away, those systems didn't break. They paused. And in that pause, questions would eventually surface. He just didn't know it yet. The week after I left, the company treated my departure as a footnote. An email went out thanking me for my contributions and wishing me well in future endeavors. My boss stopped by my old desk, joking about how fast things moved in business. People nodded, relieved by the normalcy. I watched from a distance, checking in quietly with systems I still had visibility into. At first, everything held. Then small delays appeared. Reports took longer to compile. Approvals stalled without clear reasons. Nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm. That was his strength and his weakness. He thrived on momentum and attention, not maintenance. In a leadership meeting I no longer attended, he reassured everyone that transitions were seamless. A former teammate messaged me privately, asking if I'd changed a workflow before leaving. I answered honestly, no. I asked if anything felt off. She said things were different, but probably temporary. That word lingered. Temporary implied a return to normal, a belief that the admired leader would correct course. Meanwhile, my boss took public credit for streamlining operations, announcing efficiencies that hadn't yet materialized. The applause came easily. I realized then how deeply his authority depended on assumption. As long as outcomes lagged quietly, he could speak confidently. But systems don't respect charisma. They respond to understanding. And without mine, the cracks were beginning to form, invisible at first, but spreading outward with every confident promise he made. By the third week, external partners started asking questions. Nothing accusatory, just requests for clarification that hinted at confusion. A vendor emailed me directly, unaware I'd left, asking why a contract milestone had been delayed. I forwarded the message without comment to the general inbox and watched the response time stretch. Internally, my boss announced a review of legacy processes, framing it as innovation. He assembled a task force, excluding anyone who had worked closely with me. That choice was deliberate. I saw it as confirmation. He wasn't fixing problems. He was rebranding them. Meanwhile, I reviewed the contracts I'd helped design, focusing on clauses tied to verification and escalation. They were sound, but dependent on precise interpretation. I'd been the one providing that context. Without it, compliance became guesswork. I reached out to a former colleague who'd left months earlier. She laughed softly when I described what was happening. "It always starts like that," she said. Then he blamed someone else. That conversation shifted something in me. This wasn't just my experience. It was a pattern extending backward, repeating with new faces. The admiration hadn't come from success alone. It came from narrative control. He told the story before anyone else could. But narratives weaken when facts accumulate. By the end of the week, I received a message from legal requesting clarification on a document revision I hadn't approved. I replied with evidence. The reply chain grew longer. Quietly, the mask was beginning to slip. The company announced a transparency initiative at the start of week 4. An internal memo promised clearer processes, open communication, and renewed trust. People welcomed it eagerly. I almost did too. For a moment, it seemed like accountability might finally surface without confrontation. That was the false hope. The initiative focused on culture, not controls. Feedback sessions replaced audits. Workshops replaced reviews. My boss hosted the first meeting, speaking earnestly about learning from mistakes. Applause followed, again. Behind the scenes, the same delays persisted. A partner escalated a concern directly to leadership after receiving conflicting answers from different departments. Leadership requested documentation. That request landed in legal, then quietly in my inbox, forwarded by someone who still trusted my judgment. I responded with timestamps and versions, letting the document speak. Hours later, my boss sent out another company-wide update celebrating progress. The contrast was striking. Confidence above, confusion below. I realized then that the transparency initiative wasn't a solution. It was a buffer designed to absorb frustration while preserving authority. That realization hardened my resolve. I stopped hoping the system would correct itself and started preparing for exposure instead. I organized my records into a coherent narrative, not accusatory, just factual. Patterns don't need emotion to be convincing. They need continuity. And continuity was exactly what his public image lacked. As the 4th week closed, leadership scheduled a routine internal review. My name appeared on the distribution list, added quietly at the end. That was the first sign that silence had finally been noticed. The internal review began as routine, at least on paper. A calendar invite labeled it a process alignment session, nothing that would alarm anyone confident in their narrative. I attended remotely, camera off, listening as leadership asked measured questions. My boss answered smoothly, deflecting specifics with polished language about scale and growth. When delays were mentioned, he blamed transition gaps and assured them solutions were underway. Then a reviewer asked for documentation supporting a recent contract adjustment. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but telling. My boss said the materials would be provided after the meeting. Minutes later, I received a direct request from legal asking if I had insight into the original version. I did. I sent it, along with change logs showing when and how revisions occurred. No commentary. Just files. The meeting ended politely, but the tone had shifted. Follow-up requests came faster than before, more focused, less ceremonial. That evening, a former teammate called to ask if leadership was finally looking. I told her they were asking the right questions, not yet drawing conclusions. The distinction mattered. Scrutiny doesn't announce itself loudly. It tightens quietly. As I reviewed my records again, I realized something unsettling. The review wasn't uncovering new issues. It was confirming old ones. And once confirmation replaces curiosity, outcomes become inevitable. My boss still believed this was manageable. He hadn't noticed that control had already slipped from his hands. By the 5th week, the review expanded without being renamed. Additional stakeholders joined meetings. Finance requested reconciliations that hadn't been necessary before. Legal stopped routing questions through management and contacted contributors directly. My boss responded by increasing his visibility, scheduling town halls, and reiterating confidence. The more pressure built, the more he performed reassurance. I watched the pattern repeat itself, but this time the audience was different. One afternoon, a finance director asked me to walk through a workflow I designed 2 years earlier. As I explained it, she stopped me and asked why recent reports didn't reflect the same controls. I showed her the exact point where oversight had been removed. She nodded slowly and took notes. No reaction. No judgment. Just attention. That was when I knew the mask was failing. Admiration collapses not with outrage, but with silence. People stop defending what they're still processing. Later that day, my boss emailed me directly for the first time since I'd left. He thanked me for my continued professionalism and suggested we align on messaging. The request was framed as collaboration. I declined politely, stating that accuracy mattered more than alignment. He didn't reply. Instead, a meeting was scheduled with executive leadership, excluding him. The invitation arrived in my inbox marked mandatory. For the first time, the admired leader wasn't leading the room. He was waiting outside it. The executive session was brief and focused, stripped of ceremony. Charts replaced anecdotes. Timelines replaced testimonials. I walked them through the pattern from beginning to end, not as an accusation, but as a sequence of outcomes that no longer made sense in isolation. Projects succeeded, contributors disappeared, authority concentrated. Each point was supported by records already verified by legal and finance. No one interrupted. When questions came, they were precise, almost surgical. At the end, the room sat quietly for several seconds. Then someone asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for weeks. Why hadn't this been visible sooner? I answered honestly. Because admiration discourages verification. The meeting ended without resolution, but the direction was clear. That afternoon, leadership placed my boss on temporary leave pending further review. The announcement was framed carefully, emphasizing process and neutrality. Publicly, nothing dramatic happened. Internally, everything shifted. Messages flooded in from colleagues who had once defended him, now uncertain how to feel. I didn't respond. That night, my boss called me repeatedly. I didn't answer. Silence had done its work. Not as revenge, but as contrast. Without the performance, without the audience, his influence collapsed into paperwork and questions he could no longer charm away. As the 6th week approached, the admired figure everyone trusted had become the subject of scrutiny he could no longer escape. With my boss officially on leave, the office atmosphere changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations grew quieter, more careful. People reread emails before sending them. Decisions that once sailed through now paused for confirmation. I was invited into follow-up discussions, not as a formality, but as a resource. The same people who once dismissed my concerns now asked measured questions about processes they'd never examined closely. I answered without embellishment. This wasn't a victory lap. It was an autopsy. Leadership asked me to reconstruct decision chains going back years, isolating moments where authority had shifted without accountability. Each reconstruction revealed the same mechanism: praise to disarm, delegation to distance, disappearance to erase. The elegance of it disturbed them. One executive admitted he'd trusted instinct over verification because it felt efficient. That admission mattered. It reframed the problem as systemic, not personal. Meanwhile, my boss's absence exposed dependencies no one had acknowledged. Approval stalled. Vendor relationships strained. His presence had masked gaps he'd created himself. Late that afternoon, legal informed me that external auditors would be brought in to ensure independence. The scope had expanded beyond internal correction. As I left the building, I noticed his office lights were off for the first time in years. The space looked smaller without him inside it. That image stayed with me. Power, once removed from performance, shrinks quickly. And the organization was only beginning to understand how much had been hidden behind admiration. The arrival of external auditors shifted the tone from introspection to consequence. Their questions were narrower and sharper, focused on financial exposure rather than culture. I provided records as requested, watching as timelines were mapped against revenue changes. Discrepancies that once felt abstract now carried dollar amounts. In one session, an auditor paused on a chart and asked why a profitable unit had been dissolved immediately after its peak quarter. The answer, once framed as restructuring, now looked like extraction. Leadership exchanged glances. Outside the meeting rooms, rumors spread quickly, filling gaps with speculation. My boss's supporters grew quiet, careful not to align too strongly with a narrative that was unraveling. He issued a statement through legal expressing confidence in a full review. The language was familiar, polished, and oddly hollow. I noticed how little it moved people now. Without authority, words lost weight. That evening, I received a message from a former colleague thanking me for finally making sense of things. It wasn't praise I wanted, but it confirmed something important. Recognition doesn't always arrive as applause. Sometimes it comes as relief. As the audit progressed, one conclusion became unavoidable. Admiration had allowed risk to concentrate unchecked. And once risk is quantified, it stops being theoretical. Approval stalled. Vendor relationships strained. His presence had masked gaps he'd created himself. Late that afternoon, legal informed me that external auditors would be brought in to ensure independence. The scope had expanded beyond internal correction. As I left the building, I noticed his office lights were off for the first time in years. The space looked smaller without him inside it. That image stayed with me. Power, once removed from performance, shrinks quickly. And the organization was only beginning to understand how much had been hidden behind admiration. The arrival of external auditors shifted the tone from introspection to consequence. Their questions were narrower and sharper, focused on financial exposure rather than culture. I provided records as requested, watching as timelines were mapped against revenue changes. Discrepancies that once felt abstract now carried dollar amounts. In one session, an auditor paused on a chart and asked why a profitable unit had been dissolved immediately after its peak quarter. The answer, once framed as restructuring, now looked like extraction. Leadership exchanged glances. Outside the meeting rooms, rumors spread quickly, filling gaps with speculation. My boss's supporters grew quiet, careful not to align too strongly with a narrative that was unraveling. He issued a statement through legal expressing confidence in a full review. The language was familiar, polished, and oddly hollow. I noticed how little it moved people now. Without authority, words lost weight. That evening, I received a message from a former colleague thanking me for finally making sense of things. It wasn't praise I wanted, but it confirmed something important. Recognition doesn't always arrive as applause. Sometimes it comes as relief. As the audit progressed, one conclusion became unavoidable. Admiration had allowed risk to concentrate unchecked. And once risk is quantified, it stops being theoretical. The numbers didn't argue. They accumulated. By the end of the week, leadership scheduled a board session to review findings. The admired leader everyone trusted would not be presenting. His story would be told by documents instead. The board session was closed door, but its outcome was felt immediately. Decisions cascaded downward in controlled statements and policy revisions. My boss's role was reclassified as under review, a phrase that carried more weight than any accusation. Compensation packages were frozen. Authorities over certain units were redistributed. The organization moved quickly, not out of panic, but necessity. Systems needed to function without a central figure absorbing scrutiny. I was asked to stay on temporarily as an advisor, tasked with stabilizing processes I'd once overseen quietly. I accepted on clear terms. Transparency would be operational, not performative. In the days that followed, I noticed how often people referred back to how things were always done. Habit had filled gaps where governance should have been. Breaking that habit required discomfort. During one restructuring meeting, an executive admitted that my boss's charisma had made it easier to avoid difficult questions. No one contradicted him. The silence was different now, not complicit, but reflective. Late one evening, I received a final message from my boss. It wasn't angry. It wasn't apologetic. It asked how I'd seen it coming. I didn't reply. The answer was already documented in every file he'd ignored. Patterns don't require confrontation to be exposed. They require continuity. And once continuity is established, denial becomes impossible. As the organization recalibrated, one truth became clear: admiration had once protected him. Now it had nowhere left to hide. The investigation entered a quieter phase, but its reach widened. Auditors began interviewing former employees, people whose departures had once been framed as personal choices. Their accounts aligned too neatly to dismiss. Each described praise followed by isolation, authority removed without explanation, then an exit that felt inevitable. Compiled together, their stories formed a mirror of my own experience. Leadership reviewed the transcripts with visible discomfort. What had once been isolated incidents were now a documented pattern. I was asked to contextualize certain workflows, to explain how decisions flowed before and after key personnel changes. As I spoke, I realized how much institutional memory had been concentrated in one person's hands. That concentration hadn't been accidental. It was strategic. The admired leader had positioned himself as the solution to complexity he'd quietly created. Without him, the organization struggled briefly, then adapted. That adaptation was telling. It proved he'd never been indispensable, only unchallenged. Late in the week, legal informed me that potential regulatory exposure was being assessed. The matter had moved beyond internal correction. When admiration shields misconduct, accountability arrives from outside. I left the meeting with a mix of relief and gravity. The story was no longer mine to carry alone. It belonged to records, testimonies, and outcomes that didn't care about charm. As I walked past familiar corridors, I understood that the most dangerous masks aren't worn to deceive enemies. They're worn to reassure allies. By week 7, the organization's posture shifted from defensive to corrective. Policies were rewritten in plain language. Oversight committees were restructured with clear checks. The changes were public enough to restore confidence, but specific enough to prevent repetition. I participated where needed, careful not to dominate discussions. This wasn't about replacing one central figure with another. It was about dismantling the conditions that allowed admiration to override scrutiny. My boss's name stopped appearing in conversations, replaced by phrases like the previous structure or legacy decisions. That erasure felt deliberate, not vindictive. Power fades faster when it isn't dramatized. One afternoon, a junior analyst asked how I'd stayed calm through everything. I told her the truth. I hadn't been calm. I'd been observant. There's a difference. Calm suggests detachment. Observation requires engagement without reaction. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, external auditors finalized their report. Leadership prepared for disclosure, knowing transparency now meant survival. My role concluded quietly, with thanks that felt sincere but restrained. As I packed my things, I realized how little I needed validation at this point. The outcome spoke for itself. My boss, once admired, was now a case study in governance failure. Not because he was uniquely malicious, but because the system had rewarded his performance too generously. As I left the building, I felt lighter, not triumphant. The weight had never been anger. It had been knowing the truth alone. The public announcement came on a Friday afternoon, carefully timed and carefully worded. It acknowledged governance failures, outlined corrective measures, and confirmed leadership changes without naming individuals. The market reacted briefly, then stabilized. Confidence, once shaken, returned through clarity rather than reassurance. Internally, employees read the statement with a mix of relief and retrospection. Conversations turned toward lessons rather than blame. I watched from a distance, no longer involved but still attentive. A message arrived from my former boss's attorney requesting a statement on his behalf. I declined. The facts were already documented. Any narrative he offered now would be measured against records, not rhetoric. That realization marked the final collapse of his influence. Later that evening, a former colleague sent me a screenshot of an internal training deck titled, "Recognizing Pattern-Based Risk." I smiled at that quietly. The pattern had become teachable. That was the real outcome. Not punishment, but understanding. When admiration goes unquestioned, it becomes a liability. When patterns are ignored, they repeat. As the story concluded without spectacle, I understood why silence had been so effective. It had allowed the contrast to sharpen. Charisma fades when it stands next to consistency. And consistency, once visible, doesn't need a voice to be believed. With the formal announcement behind them, the company entered a period of recalibration. New leadership emphasized structure over personality, process over performance. Meetings shortened. Documentation lengthened. Decisions slowed just enough to be deliberate. I noticed how often people paused now before agreeing, as if learning a new reflex. A former executive reached out to me privately, admitting he dismissed early warning signs because they conflicted with the image he wanted to believe in. That admission felt significant. It marked the shift from defense to accountability. Meanwhile, external partners updated contracts to reflect clearer lines of authority. Clauses I'd once drafted quietly were now cited openly, their purpose finally understood. The admired leader's absence was no longer felt as loss, but as space. Space for questions that hadn't been asked. Space for people who'd been overlooked. In that openness, trust began to rebuild, not around a person, but around systems. I declined an offer to return full-time, choosing instead to consult independently. My work was done here. As I packed my final notes, I realized the story people would tell wouldn't include my name prominently. And that was fine. The goal had never been recognition. It had been correction. As I walked out for the last time, the building felt different. Not lighter, exactly. More grounded. Admiration had once filled the room. Now it was something quieter, respect earned through scrutiny. The board released a follow-up report weeks later, summarizing findings in clear, unsparing language. Industry press picked it up, not as scandal, but as a case study in governance failure driven by unchecked charisma. My former boss was referenced indirectly, his influence reduced to footnotes and process diagrams. That reduction felt appropriate. He had thrived on presence. Documentation stripped him of it. I was invited to speak at a small internal forum about risk awareness, not to recount events, but to discuss pattern recognition. I focused on signals people tend to rationalize away: repeated departures, shifting credit, unexplained revisions. The room listened closely. These weren't abstract lessons anymore. They were lived experience. Afterward, a young manager thanked me for naming things she'd felt but couldn't articulate. That mattered more than any apology. Outside the company, my boss attempted to reframe his departure publicly, positioning it as a difference in vision. The response was muted. Without an audience primed to admire him, the story didn't travel. Silence followed, not dramatic, just final. I understood then how power truly dissipates. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. When systems no longer bend around a personality, that personality loses its gravity. And gravity, once gone, doesn't return quietly. Months later, the company announced stable growth under its new structure. No single figure dominated press releases. Teams were credited collectively. Accountability was explicit. Watching from afar, I felt a sense of closure that wasn't emotional, but logical. The outcome matched the evidence. I received occasional messages from former colleagues updating me on changes, each note carrying a subtle gratitude that felt earned rather than owed. My former boss never reached out again. His name surfaced occasionally in industry gossip, detached from authority, his reputation flattened into ambiguity. That flattening was the final consequence of the mask failing. Charisma without trust becomes noise. Reflecting on everything, I realized how easily admiration can become a shortcut for judgment. People want leaders to be exceptional because it simplifies complexity. But complexity doesn't disappear when ignored. It accumulates. The lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about attention. Patterns don't announce themselves as threats. They repeat as habits until someone stops applauding long enough to listen. Walking away in silence had given me the distance to see clearly and the time for facts to surface on their own. In the end, the admired leader fell not because I opposed him, but because the pattern he relied on finally became visible to everyone else. The final stage unfolded without drama, which felt fitting. Regulatory agencies closed their reviews with formal notices and corrective requirements, none of which mentioned personalities. The language was procedural, almost dull, but its impact was permanent. Structures that once allowed authority to drift unchecked were dismantled piece by piece. I was contacted once more to verify a historical timeline, a final cross-check before records were archived. As I reviewed the documents, I noticed how ordinary everything looked once stripped of praise and performance. Decisions that once felt bold now read as risky. Moves once framed as visionary now appeared careless. That contrast lingered with me. My boss's downfall hadn't come from exposure alone. It came from normalization. When his actions were placed alongside standards instead of stories, they couldn't hold their shape. Former colleagues told me the culture felt slower, but safer. That trade-off was intentional. Speed had been mistaken for competence for too long. One message stood out among the rest, from someone I barely knew, thanking me for not reacting loudly. She said it gave others permission to look closer. I sat with that for a while. Silence had been misread as weakness, then reinterpreted as restraint. The shift wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had stopped clapping long enough to notice the pattern underneath the applause. The board published a final addendum months later, outlining lessons learned and embedding them into mandatory training. My former boss's tenure was summarized in a single neutral paragraph. No praise. No condemnation. Just facts. That brevity carried more weight than any headline. In removing spectacle, they removed legacy. I was asked whether I wanted acknowledgement in the report. I declined. Being named would have personalized something that needed to stay structural. The true reveal wasn't about who he was, but how easily everyone, including me at first, had accepted the mask. In a private moment, one board member admitted they'd admired my boss precisely because he seemed to make leadership simple. That simplicity had been an illusion. Real leadership, they now understood, required friction. Questions. Resistance. Without those, admiration curdles into risk. As I read the addendum, I felt the story closing cleanly. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology. Just resolution through clarity. The admired figure had been reduced to a lesson, his influence diluted into policy language and case examples. That was the most complete collapse possible. Power didn't leave him in a moment. It drained away as people stopped believing the story he told about himself. Life moved on in ways that felt quietly satisfying. I built my consulting work around governance design, helping organizations recognize patterns before they hardened into habits. Each engagement echoed pieces of the past, but none carried its emotional weight. Distance had done its work. Occasionally, someone would recognize my name and ask if the story had been difficult. I answered honestly. The difficulty wasn't in leaving or being humiliated. It was in watching admiration blind people I respected. That understanding softened resentment into something more useful. Patience. My former boss faded further into obscurity, his attempts at reinvention never quite gaining traction. Without an audience willing to suspend disbelief, charisma had nowhere to land. Looking back, I understood why walking away in silence had been so effective. It denied him conflict, denied him narrative fuel, and allowed the pattern to complete itself under observation. The real revenge wasn't exposure. It was inevitability. When systems are designed to reward performance over accountability, collapse is only a matter of time. All I'd done was stop participating in the illusion. As the chapter closed, one truth remained clear. Admiration is powerful, but attention is stronger. And once attention replaces applause, masks don't survive long enough to be missed. Everyone had admired my boss. I had been the only one who saw the pattern, not because I was smarter, but because I stopped reacting and started observing. That distinction mattered more than any confrontation ever could. In the end, nothing explosive happened. No public confession. No dramatic reckoning. Just a quiet alignment between facts and outcomes that left no room for denial. The organization didn't collapse. It corrected. People didn't turn cruel. They turned careful. And the admired figure who once commanded every room became a reference point in training slides, stripped of personality and reduced to process failure. That felt right. Looking back, I understood that the humiliation hadn't been the turning point. It had been the signal. A test to see whether I would argue, protest, or perform outrage. Walking away in silence had denied him the response he expected and given me the space to see clearly. The lesson I carried forward was simple and enduring. Admiration should always invite questions, not replace them. When someone is trusted too easily, patterns have room to grow unchecked. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of clarity rather than surrender. I didn't win by defeating my boss. I won by refusing to play the role he'd assigned me. The pattern revealed itself because I let it run its course under scrutiny. And once seen, it never needed my voice again to be believed.